Hello there and welcome. It is Wednesday evening here on the West Coast, and I'm excited to talk to you about this topic of functional neurologic disorders and sensory symptoms based on a great question that somebody sent to me. So we're going to dive in, and feel free to put your questions, comments in the chat here. You can send me questions and I will try to get to all of them as well. If we haven't met, my name is Julie Hirschberg. I'm a neurologic physical therapist and pretty obsessed with all things brain. And that reminds me, actually, I'm going to grab my brain model before we get started, because we're definitely going to talk about some of the connectivity things in the brain. But my practice is here in Los Angeles. We have an integrated neurologic rehabilitation practice with physical therapy, occupational therapy, and psychology. Focus on a really whole person approach to rehab and getting people back to life. And one of those people that is back at life is back at work, actually, this week. She sent me a question. So thank you for sending this. I'm going to read it to you. And then we're going to talk about not only this, but other sensory pieces in functional neurologic disorders. So this was the question. I've been experiencing what I can only describe as phantom tremors. What a great term, by the way. They aren't painful, and to me, it makes sense after years of that learned sensation. So she's already understanding what these are. Clinicians, when I tell you, listen to your patients. This is why they know, they already understand. She learned the sensory experience of tremors, even if she's not experiencing tremors. I feel a sensation in the area that I would usually experience a tremor, different areas depending on the movement. I look at my body and can see that the tremor isn't happening, and it feels a bit different than it used to, which is good. But I have to remind myself that my body really is still. Good job at that. Is this something you hear others discuss or are familiar hearing? So I would love to hear from you if this is something you've experienced, like this sensation of tremoring or movement, or even like a sensation of hot or cold and nothing is there. This person's asking, has other people had this? I have definitely heard this before. I've gotten these sensations. So I want to talk about how this occurring is actually a very normal occurrence to occur in anybody because of the way our nervous system is wired. And because in the very special brain of a person with a functional neurologic disorder, this type of phenomenon might occur even more rapidly. So, I love that you use this term phantom tremor, and I might even call it a phantom sensation, meaning a sensation is occurring and nothing's there. And I want to give you an example of this happening to loads of people across the world, and it's the good old Apple Watch. So if you wear an Apple Watch and you have any notifications set, it vibrates. And if you wear any kind of device that gives you feedback on something, it might vibrate. Or if you hold your phone in your pocket and things like that, you might get used to it vibrating. And I know this happens to me, but it turns out this is a worldwide, happens to millions of people phenomena. They get a vibration. They're like, I wonder if somebody texted me, and they're not even wearing their watch. That is a similar phantom sensation. So you're sensing vibration, and this happens to me all of the time because I always wear my watch. Or I should say, it happens to me all the time because I always wear my watch. So I'm learning that vibration. But then when I take my watch off, usually at the end of the day or in the morning, I will still feel vibration, and I'll look to see who is texting me, and I don't have my watch on. So a sensation is occurring that has nothing to do with what is actually happening in the receptors of my skin or the hairs on my arm, and it is being produced by the brain. And This happens all of the time because our brains, they're super smart. And one of the ways they are wired for action is to predict things to occur. And when things occur very commonly, and sensory things do, they will actually predict that even if they're not occurring. Now, that makes sense, right? With the Apple Watch and with any other activity or movement or behavior that you have in your body. Your brain learns that movement pattern and the sensory feedback that comes with that movement pattern. So let's take the case of what this person had asked me. They had been experiencing tremors. The tremors are gone because this person did a therapy program with us, and a lot of the abnormal or uncontrolled movements are gone, but the sensation was still there. Well, I'm not surprised, just as this person stated, that the brain learned what it was like to feel constant tremoring in different body parts. And by the way, this doesn't have to be just tremor. It could be dystonia. It could be slowed movement like we see in Parkinson's. It could be particular movement patterns. It could be spasticity. Our brain learns that pattern, and our brain also learns the sensation of that pattern. And the brain does not actually have to have the sensation or movement occurring to generate it, which is just the case in my Apple Watch. I take it off, I still feel a vibration. There is nothing happening there peripherally, yet I am experiencing it. This is very similar to pain. I had a stress fracture in my leg last year. The other day, I was driving and super stressed out and sleep deprived. It felt like I had just fractured my leg in the same exact place. There was nothing going on there. I wasn't even weight bearing on it, and I knew that, right? But there it was. It was a sensory experience triggered by my brain. So you do not have to have the movement occurring or actually peripheral input for the brain to trigger a sensory experience. So I brought a couple of pieces of literature because I can, tell you about my personal experience and my Apple Watch. I can talk about our clinical experience, but if you know me, I love to look at the research. What does the research say about this? And there's two particular pieces that I find so very interesting. And I want to start away from functional neurologic disorders for a moment because there's an area in the literature that has been very well researched, and that is phantom limb pain. By the way, not limited to just pain. So phantom limb sensations, hot, cold, tremor, movement, all of those things also occur, not just pain, but the pain can become very disabling for a person who has had an amputation. If you're not familiar with phantom limb pain, this occurs after a person has had an amputation and they actually still feel sensations in their toes. So let's say they amputated their toes. They still feel sensation in their great toe, and it doesn't exist. And the understanding of phantom limb pain is actually quite complex. So I went back to the literature because I worked with people with amputees or amputations early on in my career, but it's been a while. So I was curious what the literature said, and I found this article from 2022, and it was perfect for your question, Dana. So it said, Unveiling the Phantom, What Neuroimaging Has Taught Us About Phantom Limb Pain. And what they did is actually looked at all of the neuroimaging studies that have been done in phantom limb pain, kind of brought them together. So they looked at diffusion tensor imaging. They looked at EEG and MEG. They looked at fMRI, which we talk a lot about in terms of functional neurologic disorders. And in many ways, the idea of phantom limb pain is kind of like a functional sensory disorder. And I say that because it's a connectivity issue in the brain. The pain from a phantom limb, from a amputated limb, is not going to necessarily show up on MRI, but some of the things that they have found are showing up on EEG or fMRI. And there was one other, the diffusion tensor imaging as well. And really what they found are some of these connectivity pieces that have gone awry in phantom limb pain don't look that different from functional neurologic disorders and what we see. So I will tell you, without going, we could spend a whole lot of time on phantom limb pain. I kind of did a little down the rabbit hole here, and I was so fascinated. There are different theories that look at brain changes, spinal cord changes, even peripheral nerve changes in phantom limb pain. There's not one theory that has come out as predominant. Surprise! Same in many neurologic disorders. It's complex, it's multidimensional, it's multifactorial. We should stop being surprised about that. But I think our black and white, like, we want an answer, one thing, and haven't found it. But in this study, they did nicely look at some of those connectivity changes. So one of them, I gotta bring up the brain, remapping. So changes in, let me look at this brain here. So the primary somatosensory cortex, S1 is what it's also called. They found that people had remapping of that area, meaning the sensory area changed. They found also that distinct areas in the sensory cortex were activated following stimulation of a person's stump after their amputation. They also found motor cortex activity changes. It's not even a motor issue. So again, a connectivity issue or changes. And also there's some things that they found were some changes in how the normal inhibitory networks of the brain were working. So typically we have particular areas of the brain that would inhibit different sensations from occurring, and they found changes in that, as well as increased excitability. So, really fascinating. By the way, the study, I gave you the name, Unveiling the Phantom, What Neuroimaging Has Taught Us About Phantom Limb Pain. It's a review study. It was published in 2022 in Brain and Behavior. The first author is Jonathan Brown. It's free full text. I will put it in our newsletter. So every week I write a newsletter. I include all the videos that we do during the week, all the tips that we share, and all of the links. So I will link specifically to this. If you're a clinician, join at reactiveeducation.com. If you're a patient, join at reactivept.com. So that was the first study looking at phantom limb pain. Now, another study just came out in October. I've been holding on to this one for a while, wanting to talk to you all about it. And it is so interesting, so very interesting. In this study, again, original research published in Frontiers in Neurology, October 2023, and it is titled Sensory Nerve Action Potential in Patients with Functional Neurologic Disorders with Sensory Manifestations. This study was done out of Japan, by the way. It's so interesting. So sensory nerve action potentials, if you haven't heard of it, it's also called SNAP. This is a common study that they might do in a person with a peripheral neuropathy to look at how fast things are traveling down a peripheral nerve. And they did this to look at, are there changes in people with functional neurologic disorders who have sensory symptoms? And they had 76 people, which I think is a really good number. 76 people with FND with sensory manifestations who did nerve conduction studies, which many patients do when they're looking at other, is this peripheral neuropathy of some sort? And then they compared the amplitudes of these SNAPs, so the sensory nerve action potential. You look at an amplitude, you look kind of at a wave. They actually hypothesized that the SNAP potentials would be higher in people with FND. Prior studies had actually shown that the SNAP potentials were hyper excitable in folks with FND. And this actually made sense to me. We see that a lot. We see just differences in somebody's sensory perception, sometimes under that they might have less sensory perception, but a lot of times a hyperactivity in that sensory perception. I'm not talking about hyperactivity as in their movement, but it's a very excitable where a person is extremely sensitive to touch. And so what they did, they tested everybody. They compared folks to other folks with other disorders as well, and found no difference. So people with functional neurologic disorders don't have, at least this group of 76 people, did not have changes in a sensory nerve action potential. So it wasn't diminished. They didn't have a peripheral neuropathy, but it also wasn't hyper excitable. I think that's very interesting. And the reason I was excited to bring this study in is because a lot of times when you're presented as a physical therapist that screens a person thoroughly in their nervous system, when a person is telling me they can't feel things, the first thing I'm wondering is where in that sensory system might there be a dysfunction? And the first place I start is in the periphery. The periphery is where our sensory system starts, right? So we've got receptors in the skin that's transmitted through peripheral nerves that bring information into the spinal cord, that synapse and share information for reflexes in the spinal cord. I don't have a spinal cord here, but you can imagine it attaching to the brainstem. That sensory information, it goes all different places in the brainstem and then into the cortex. And what the research has found so far in functional neurologic disorders, much like phantom limb pain, is that the issue is not necessarily down here in the periphery, probably not in the brainstem, but in some cortical reorganization in the brain. And as Dana asked, because frankly, Dana, you're smarter than me, she asked, does this tie back to sensory smudging? Absolutely. So if you haven't heard the term sensory smudging, if you imagine this sensory cortex as part of your brain, has this map. It's a really interesting map of your body, and it's called a homunculus, the way it's organized. It's got gigantic lips and gigantic hands. It has larger representations for places that we feel a lot of sensation. what has been found in some studies across many different diagnoses, but dystonia is one and functional neurologic disorders is another, is that there may be for some people, instead of having really distinct, let's use the hand, for example, these are some of the original studies in neuroplasticity. Instead of someone having really distinct representation of all the fingers, let's say maybe they have a dystonia, there's a smudging in that cortex, and maybe it kind of looks like this, and without distinct representations. And because of the way our movement is organized to get feedback from the body, to use that sensory information and that map to tell us what to do, if that map is incorrect or if it's getting poor feedback from the body, then the motor system may generate involuntary movements. So the idea of smudging occurring, this is something that's very common in pain, as I mentioned, in phantom limb pain as well. And what we're kind of extrapolating that to functional neurologic disorders. It's also common in dystonia. So it makes sense to me if a person's body representation, sensory-wise, is incorrect in the cortex. It's not accurate, which can happen for many reasons, right? It could have happened because of an injury, which is a really common one. Boy, does the sensory cortex change when you're in a boot, like if you fractured your foot or you're in a cast or things like that, it immediately changes. It's so interesting. But it happens with injuries. It can happen if you, like Dana had asked, are you experiencing abnormal movements like tremors? And also the tremors can be caused by a poor representation of the body. You can imagine that the body might produce tremoring movement when it doesn't know where it is in space. And therefore, testing proprioception, testing kinesthesia, testing the map, sensory discrimination, stereognosis, graphesthesia, testing the map of the body would give us the underlying reason why that person might be experiencing abnormal movement. So absolutely, yes. Now, I got a couple of other questions that I didn't want to forget, so I wrote them down because I will forget things quickly, from other clinicians. So, and I saw in the comment here, somebody said, I can't feel the floor. So this is a really great place to start. If a person cannot feel or not aware of sensation, and this is what one person asked me, where do you start when someone has no sensation as part of their FND with paralysis? Great question. So this is common that a person with functional weakness may also experience a functional sensory loss. And we need to figure out, one, what kind of sensory loss is it? Is it all sensations, or are there some pieces that are actually making their way up to being recognized in the brain? Vibration, deep sensation or pressure, hot and cold. I would be looking at those because that's like a little pathway we could take if the person's able to experience them. So I want to understand the extent of that. And honestly, just like any other neurologic disorder where the person is not experiencing sensation, I want to build activities that bring in some automatic sensation for them. So functional activities, right? So that might be, if the person is paralyzed, that might be rolling in bed, that might be scooting around in bed, that might be playing things, lying on our back or lying in prone, that might be scooting on different surfaces. So I'm going to tell you, I do all of this stuff with a person with a spinal cord injury too, because we want to drive any pieces of sensation that a person might have intact and not let them go due to disuse. So same principles apply where we might start with sensation. Now, something else that I always have to think about is there are other reasons why a person might not experience sensation in their body. A lack of sensation can be a protective response of the brain. So it could be protective. So the brain may have created a state of no sensation because the person was in extreme pain. The brain might have created the state of not experiencing sensation because of frequent injuries or hypermobility. It doesn't mean that person has a neuropathy or a spinal cord injury, but again, the brain does really creative things to keep us safe. Now, not as common, but it's something that I always want to think about. And because I'm on an integrated team, I always have a team to help me figure this out. But also, patients tell me, hey, I had a really traumatic physical injury or psychological injury, and I had to cut off from my body to survive. Maybe they went through war. Maybe they went through a really traumatic event. This is not everybody, but when a patient tells me that, I listen. And I understand the brain can create safety by disconnecting from that limb, from that body part. And if all I do is throw sensory information at that or try movement, I'm not getting down to the bottom of this. So when it comes to the sensory system, having a sense of safety is really important, because a person who, if that has been their experience, they're not going to be able to reconnect to their body just by throwing sensation, just by throwing movement. And I'm doing this like we throw things as therapists. I'm like grossly overgeneralizing. We don't do that. But taking that into consideration. And this is why we have psychology on our team. That's not my expertise. Now, can I create a safe place? Yes. Can I create a trusting place to explore movement and sensation again? Yes. But I rely on my colleagues to really help me understand and help the person understand what components of safe sensation might we be able to do. And then sometimes it's working those gradually back in. So we may actually apply the principles of like graded motor imagery, like imagined sensations. So again, this person asks, where do you start? You might start with imagined sensations. Those might be too traumatic for a person. So then you got to even step back from there. But maybe they're not. Or maybe it's in a virtual reality environment. Or maybe you can do it with a mirror and you can do sensation on one side of the body. All of those would be great places that you can start for when somebody has no sensation and a functional paralysis. Now, this actually really gets me connected to the next question somebody asked me is, do you make goals related to improving sensation? And if so, how do you make them functional? What a great question. Such a therapist question, because you know what? We're always justifying everything that we do to the insurance. So we have to have really good goals. And what I would say as an answer to this is they should always be a functional goal with a side of sensation is what I would tell you. So for example, a really good example is somebody that maybe actually has CRPS or an allodynia, and they're not able to tolerate putting on a sock. Very functional goal. It has huge sensory pieces. So your goal would actually be related to putting on a sock. I honestly am not going to do any sensory training or treatment if it is not related to something that person wants to do, right? So you're going to make the goal about that goal that that person wants to achieve. And you are going to incorporate this into the sensory piece into that goal, or your treatment sensory wise is going to be constantly directed towards that goal. So I say this because, oh my gosh, I'm going to go way back, but back in the day when I was a new therapist and I worked at a hospital, we had people in coma and we would do coma stimulation things. And we had little brushes and different types of sensory pieces when a person was in a coma. That really didn't have any functional bearing. It was really a stimulation program. I would not ever just do give a sensory stimulus to give a sensory stimulus. I'm going to make that very functionally related for that person. So I'll give an example here because this one can be hard to connect. We like to do sensory discrimination training where I've showed this before. We do a grid, and I use the neck because we might do this in cervical dystonia. We do a grid, a person identifies different pieces to see if they can discriminate different areas. And you might go, how is that at all related to their function? So what I'm going to do is test it. And then we're going to directly relate it to their movement control, their functional abilities with their neck. So for a lot of my folks with cervical dystonia, it's driving and looking over their shoulders. So even if I'm doing the training, I'm going to go right to that. And I'm going to do the training with a very functional object. So if a person has, let's go back to the sock example. If they can't tolerate the sock, I'm going to try a softer sock, right? I'm going to try different variations of fabrics and things to get to their goal instead of doing what I would say standard sensory items because they're not functionally related. So I hope that makes sense. But what great questions from folks. Because, and great questions, because sensory symptoms in people with functional neurologic disorders can look so many different ways. It can be like this great question that sparked this discussion today. So thank you, Dana. It could be this sensation of a movement. So an internal sensation of tremor or movement that you know is not there, but you're feeling it. So it could be that phantom sensation. It could be no sensation. I can't feel anything. It can be abnormal sensation. So I feel really hot. I feel really cold. I feel like there's little pinpricks on me. I feel that there's pressure or compression on me and it's not there. So really unusual sensations that don't match what you're seeing. And pain. Pain is a sensation, and pain is a really, really common piece of functional neurologic disorders. So the sensory system, I think it's a really important piece of really understanding what the underlying pieces are for a person with functional neurologic disorder and incorporating those into treatment. And I didn't even talk about sensory profiles. I didn't even talk about sensory processing today. I talked about those before. I could talk about those in the future, but that's even a whole nother big piece of functional neurologic disorders. Now, I'm just going to make sure I got to all of the questions. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in here. Yeah, so we talked sensory smudging. We talked about like when you can't feel anything, like the floor. Makes it really hard to walk, right? Makes it really hard to do functional activities. Yes, and Ethnicity of Garden says, I remember those days. Yes. So there you have it. We talked about the sensory symptoms in FND. Particularly, we talked about this idea of phantom sensations. We related it to the literature in phantom limb pain, and we brought in some literature in functional neurologic disorders that show that some of those peripheral nerve amplitudes are actually the same in functional neurologic disorders. So there might not be an impairment there. And we brought it back to the brain. The changes being within the brain, within the cortex, within how that sensory information is organized and how it's communicating and giving feedback to other parts of the body. And then finally, we talked about the power of prediction, which is exactly how Dana kind of framed this question. Like, I've learned this sensation and now my brain is predicting it, even though I'm not moving that way. Brains are just so interesting to be able to do that, to be able to predict. Now, here's the thing. If you've been experiencing sensory symptoms, if you're working with somebody who's had sensory symptoms or other functional neurologic symptoms for a long time, and the brain has developed a learned pattern of prediction, it's not set in stone. It's not forever. It's a malleable, it's a plastic. This brain is literally plastic, but it can make changes. That is the beauty of a nervous system disorder that is based on connection changes, is that we can change those. And it doesn't require neurosurgery. It just requires neuro rehab. And sometimes it can take a long time if you've had symptoms for a while. Sometimes it can happen really quickly. That's what gives me hope in functional neurologic disorders. So again, if you are a clinician, I'll send those articles, those great articles from today. I will send our videos from this week in our newsletter. Sign up at reactiveeducation.com. If you are a patient, sign up at reactivept.com. And I will see you again soon. Thanks so much for joining me.